St. Adrian's Hospital was quiet under the weight of the night shift. The lights flickered occasionally, and the steady hum of machines filled the air, adding a soft backdrop to the routine of doctors and nurses gliding through the hallways. The staff, well acquainted with the pace and pressure of the hospital, moved methodically from one task to the next, monitoring patients, adjusting IVs, and checking vitals, all with the efficiency of those who had done it thousands of times before. In one corner, a few late-night visitors rested in the waiting area, their tired faces reflecting the long hours of worry. In another, the sounds of distant conversations blended with the occasional clink of medical tools. But despite the activity, the night held a certain stillness, as if the hospital was holding its breath. Amidst this calm, the last thing anyone expected was the sudden appearance of a dog. The automatic doors at the entrance of the hospital slid open with a soft hiss, and in trotted a golden retriever. His fur shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, a striking contrast against the clinical sterility of the building. His nose was alert, his eyes wide and filled with a quiet determination. No one stopped him as he made his way down the hallway, his paws clicking against the smooth tile floor. No one noticed him at first. In a place where every inch of space was accounted for, a wandering dog might easily slip under the radar. Perhaps they thought he was a therapy dog. Hospitals often welcomed them to soothe anxious patients, or maybe he had simply slipped through unnoticed, a stray dog making its way through the automatic doors. But Charlie, for that was his name, wasn't a random visitor. He wasn't there by chance. His movements were purposeful. He knew exactly where he was going. His pace was calm, unhurried, but steady, as though guided by an unseen force. With every step, he drew closer to his destination. The quiet corridors seemed to open for him, almost as if they were aware of his presence, guiding him forward. As he passed the nurse's station, Nurse Grace briefly caught a glimpse of him. She was fatigued from a long shift, her eyes heavy, her mind drifting with the exhaustion. At first, she thought little of it. A dog had wandered in, likely one of the therapy animals making its rounds. But there was something about the dog's presence that felt different, something almost deliberate. She brushed the feeling aside, attributing it to her tiredness. Charlie, however, paid her no mind. His gaze never wavered from the path ahead. His destination was clear, and he would reach it. This version still conveys the hospital's routine setting, but with a stronger emphasis on the dog's mysterious purpose and the subtle feeling that something unique is about to happen. Would you like to move forward, or adjust anything in this version? Charlie made his way deeper into the hospital, his golden fur contrasting against the cold, clinical white walls. He passed unnoticed by most, a small flicker of movement in the otherwise still night. His path was precise, his focus unwavering. He didn't pause, didn't wander, but moved with an almost uncanny certainty toward a specific place. The hospital's neon lights flickered overhead as he approached the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, a small, sterile room where life and death hung in delicate balance. Inside, a baby lay connected to a network of machines, tubes, wires, heart monitors, each piece of equipment silently working to keep her alive. The infant, barely clinging to life, was the focus of the staff's attention. Her fragile body seemed too small for the world it inhabited, a tiny heartbeat struggling to keep pace with the immense pressure of life. Nurse Grace had spent months attending to this child. She had seen the highs and lows, the glimmers of hope that often turned to despair. Every day, she walked into the NICU, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this baby's future was uncertain, that the fight for survival could end at any moment. She had watched the baby's heart monitor, once steady, now showing erratic beeps as the infant's health deteriorated. The doctors had said there was little more to be done. Every possible intervention had been attempted. Yet here, in the quiet of the night, something different was happening. As Charlie reached the door to the NICU, he nudged it open with his nose, slipping inside without a sound. His movements were gentle, purposeful, as though he knew exactly what needed to be done. He quietly padded over to the crib, where the baby lay, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Nurse Grace, who had been preparing the baby's chart, turned just in time to see him enter. At first, she was startled, ready to call security to remove the uninvited visitor. But then, something stopped her. Perhaps it was the peaceful aura surrounding him, the way the tension in the room seemed to ease the moment he stepped through the door. Charlie didn't cause any disruption. He didn't bark or jump on the crib. Instead, he lay down beside the baby, curling up close to her, as if to protect her. His calm presence seemed to settle the room, and in that moment, Nurse Grace couldn't help but feel a small, inexplicable spark of hope. The steady beeping of the heart monitor, once erratic and quick, slowed to a more regular rhythm. It was almost imperceptible, but there was no denying the shift. For the first time in days, the baby's vitals showed small signs of improvement. Nurse Grace couldn't explain it. She wasn't even sure she should believe it. But there was something undeniable about Charlie's presence, something that seemed to make the world feel a little lighter, a little brighter, even in the face of such overwhelming uncertainty. She stepped closer, not wanting to disturb the delicate bond forming between the baby and the dog. Charlie's gaze met hers briefly, calm and understanding, as if he knew she was watching. He lay there quietly, offering the baby a silent comfort that no words or machines could provide. As the night wore on, Nurse Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something profound was unfolding in the NICU. The shift had been long, and she was tired. She had seen countless patients come and go, watched many recover, and many more lose their battle. Yet tonight, something felt different. Something in the air was lighter, less oppressive. Sitting at the nurse's station, Grace rubbed her tired eyes and glanced over at the baby's monitor. It was a sight she had seen many times, but tonight, the steady rhythm of the beeping felt like a small victory. The baby, once teetering on the edge of life, now seemed to be holding her ground. She glanced around the ICU, looking for a sign of why this change had occurred. She had been monitoring the baby's vitals closely for weeks, hoping for the slightest improvement, and now it seemed to be happening. But there was no logical explanation for it. At least, none that she could see. Then she remembered Charlie. The golden retriever had entered the NICU earlier that night, unnoticed by most. But Grace couldn't ignore the way the dog had acted. Charlie hadn't been frantic or confused. He had walked into the hospital as though he had a purpose, as if he had been led here by something greater than instinct. And now, lying beside the baby's crib, the dog's presence seemed to be making a difference. His calm demeanor, his quiet companionship, was having an effect that no medical equipment could replicate. Grace wasn't the type to believe in superstitions or unfounded beliefs. She had spent her career in the hospital system, relying on science and data to guide her decisions. But as she stood there, watching Charlie's quiet influence on the baby's health, she couldn't deny that something extraordinary was happening. It wasn't just a coincidence. She could feel it. The baby's vitals, which had fluctuated dangerously in recent days, were stabilizing. The monitor's once erratic beeps had softened, and now the rhythm was more consistent, more reassuring. Grace leaned against the wall, staring at the screen in disbelief. Could a dog really have such an impact on a child's recovery? Her mind raced as she considered the possibilities. She had seen the baby's condition worsen with each passing day, but with Charlie's presence in the room, there was a shift. Something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. And it wasn't just the baby who seemed affected. Grace felt something within herself as well. The constant weight of exhaustion, the emotional toll of the long hours in the ICU, seemed to lift when Charlie was around. She couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was the sense of calm the dog brought with him, or perhaps it was the strange feeling that there was something more happening here than met the eye. Whatever it was, Grace couldn't ignore the connection that had formed between Charlie and the baby, and in turn, the way it was affecting her. But there was no scientific explanation for what she was witnessing. Grace knew that. She was a nurse, trained to rely on evidence and fact. Still, she couldn't deny the growing sense of hope she felt every time she saw Charlie by the baby's side. Could it be that the dog, with his quiet loyalty, had somehow become part of this child's fight for survival? With a heavy sigh, Grace stepped forward toward the crib. As she did, she looked down at the baby, whose heart rate had slowed, now resting peacefully in the rhythmic pulse of life. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Real hope. But the real question lingered in the back of her mind. Could Charlie really be the one making the difference? Or was it just a strange coincidence that couldn't be explained? The tension in the ICU grew palpable as the days went on. Grace couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut, the one telling her that something precious and irreplaceable was happening between Charlie and the baby. The child, who had been on the brink of death only days ago, now seemed to be stabilizing, and the only variable that had changed was Charlie's presence. It was undeniable. The baby responded to the dog, but not everyone in the hospital saw it that way. One morning, as Grace was walking through the halls, she overheard a conversation between Dr. Carter and one of the senior nurses. The senior physician's voice was low but firm. "Grace has been letting that dog into the ICU," Dr. Carter was saying. "We can't keep doing this. The hospital has strict protocols. The presence of a dog in this unit is both a distraction and a risk. We're removing him today." Grace stopped in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold at the thought of Charlie being taken away. She had always respected Dr. Carter. His experience and dedication to the hospital's regulations were unquestionable. But now, standing there, Grace felt her trust in the system falter. The idea of removing Charlie felt wrong, like ripping apart a thread of hope. But how could she fight against the rules of the very place she worked? She was just a nurse. She didn't have the authority to make decisions like that. Despite her panic, Grace walked briskly toward the ICU, her thoughts racing. She had to do something. As she approached the unit, she spotted Charlie lying calmly beside the crib, his head resting near the baby's tiny hand. His presence seemed to radiate a quiet strength, an understanding of something deeper than she could comprehend. The baby, who had been so fragile just days before, now appeared stronger, her chest rising and falling with ease, her vitals stabilizing. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a sense of peace in the air. But how long would it last if Charlie was removed? When Grace entered the room, she immediately noticed the presence of hospital security guards, standing stiffly by the door. Their arrival was a silent acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Carter was already there, standing by the crib with his arms crossed, his expression a mix of frustration and skepticism. His eyes, usually so confident, now held a trace of uncertainty. "Grace, this dog has to go," he said, his voice resolute. "There's no data, no proof that he's having any effect on the baby. He's a distraction to the staff and a risk to the infant. We cannot continue allowing this." Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. She understood Dr. Carter's position. The hospital ran on evidence and protocol. But in her heart, she knew what Charlie had done for the baby. She couldn't just stand by and watch him be taken away. She glanced down at the dog, whose gentle eyes seemed to meet hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. She reached down to stroke his fur, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. "Please," she said, her voice cracking as she turned to Dr. Carter. "You can't do this. You've seen the baby's improvement. We can't ignore what's happening here, even if we can't explain it. Please, just one more day." The room fell silent as Dr. Carter studied her. His face was unreadable, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. The guards, who had been waiting for an order, remained still. Grace's plea hung in the room like a fragile thread, but she refused to look away from Dr. Carter's eyes, even though she knew her request was pushing the boundaries of hospital policy. "I'm not asking for a miracle, Dr. Carter," Grace continued, her voice now steady. "I'm asking for a chance to give this baby the best shot at life. If anything happens, it's on me. But you can't take him away now. Not when we're so close." There was a long pause as Dr. Carter took in her words. His gaze softened for a moment, just a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Grace could see that he was wrestling with his own beliefs, his medical training, his years of experience, and now this inexplicable situation that challenged everything he knew. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, his shoulders sagging. "Fine," he muttered. "One more night. But this is on you, Grace. If something goes wrong, it's your responsibility." Grace's heart lifted with a mix of relief and guilt. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you." As Dr. Carter and the guards slowly left the room, Grace remained by the crib, her gaze fixed on Charlie. The baby was sleeping peacefully, and for the first time in days, Grace allowed herself a moment to breathe. But she knew this was only temporary. Tomorrow was uncertain, and she couldn't be sure of the future. But tonight, Charlie would stay. That night, the ICU was unusually quiet. The hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses moving between rooms created a calming rhythm. But for Grace, the noise of the world outside seemed distant. Her eyes never left the crib, where the baby lay, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady breaths. And beside her, lying motionless but always watchful, was Charlie. Grace could feel the weight of the promise she'd made to Dr. Carter pressing on her chest. "One more night," he had said. But in her heart, Grace knew that what they were witnessing was something that defied logic, defied all the regulations that governed this hospital. Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a part of this baby's recovery, and Grace couldn't let him go now, not when she knew he was the reason the child was still alive. As the hours stretched on, Grace stayed by the crib, her hand gently resting on Charlie's back. The dog seemed content, his breathing steady as he lay by the baby's side. In that quiet space, Grace allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. She was holding on to the hope that somehow, this fragile life they were all fighting for would hold on a little longer. But just as dawn's first light began to filter into the ICU, something extraordinary happened. A soft, barely audible sound reached Grace's ears, something she hadn't expected but had desperately prayed for. The baby's tiny fingers twitched. Then, with a sudden, surprising movement, her eyes fluttered open. Grace gasped, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, her hands trembling. The baby's eyes met hers, wide and curious, a look of recognition in those tiny, bright pupils. It was as though the child was seeing the world for the first time, as if she had just come back from the edge of the abyss. Before Grace could call for the doctors, the room was already filling with nurses, the sounds of rushed footsteps and excited voices echoing through the ICU. They gathered around the crib, their faces filled with disbelief as they checked the baby's vitals. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing normal, more stable than it had been in weeks. There was no explanation for this sudden improvement, no scientific reason behind it. But it was happening, right before their eyes. Charlie, lying peacefully beside the crib, seemed to know the moment had arrived. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting Grace's with a quiet, knowing gaze. There was something profound in that look, something almost human. He had done what he had come to do. Grace watched as the doctors rushed to administer more tests, trying to find any rational explanation for the baby's sudden improvement. But there was no medical reasoning, no explanation that could account for the miracle unfolding in front of them. The baby, once critical, was now on the road to recovery. The following hours were filled with activity as medical staff worked to stabilize the baby further. But despite all the testing, all the machines and all the protocols, no one could offer a concrete reason for the child's sudden turnaround. It was a miracle that could not be explained, only felt. As the day passed, the baby continued to improve. Grace sat quietly at the crib, her hand resting gently on Charlie's fur. He had been there when no one else was, offering comfort, strength, and, somehow, healing. And now, it seemed, his work was done. Later that afternoon, as the doctors began discussing transferring the baby out of the ICU, Grace stood at the window, watching as Charlie quietly nudged her hand, a soft reminder that it was time for him to go. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of calm and finality. Charlie stood up slowly, his tail wagging just slightly. He looked once more at the baby, now stable, her vitals steady, and then, with a quiet determination, he padded toward the door. Grace followed him, her heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She knew that Charlie's time in the ICU had come to an end, but the bond between them, between him and the baby, would remain forever. As Charlie stepped out of the room, he paused for a moment, his head turning back to look at Grace. There was no need for words. They both knew that their time together had changed everything. And then, with a final, gentle nudge of her hand, he was gone. The ICU felt quieter without him, the absence of his steady presence almost palpable. But the baby, alive, breathing steadily, was proof that Charlie's visit had been more than a simple act of kindness. It had been a miracle. Grace stood in the doorway, watching as the last of Charlie's footsteps faded away. She didn't fully understand what had happened. There was no explanation for the unexplainable. But one thing she knew for certain: some things in life couldn't be explained by science, and not everything needed to be. Sometimes, healing came in the most unexpected forms. In the weeks that followed, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm. The ICU, once filled with the constant hum of machines and the urgent calls of medical staff, now seemed quieter. The staff continued their routines, but something had shifted, something that no one could quite explain. The baby, once critically ill, was now thriving. She had been moved out of the ICU and into a regular ward, where her recovery continued to astound the medical team. Grace, however, couldn't shake the memory of the dog who had been at the center of it all. Charlie. His quiet presence in that sterile, cold environment had brought something that no machine or medication could: hope. She often found herself looking out the hospital windows, wondering where he had gone after leaving the ICU, what new purpose he had found. One afternoon, as Grace sat by the baby's crib in the ward, watching the little girl sleep soundly, she found herself reflecting on the miracle that had unfolded in that hospital room. The connection between Charlie and the baby was something that no one could explain, not even the most seasoned doctors. It was beyond science, beyond reason, and yet it had happened. The baby had opened her eyes, the monitors had beeped in steady rhythms, and for the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to believe in something bigger than herself. Sometimes, Grace mused, miracles weren't just about life-saving surgeries or groundbreaking medical breakthroughs. Sometimes they were about moments of quiet, unspoken connection. Moments where faith, no matter how small, made all the difference. A few days later, Grace was sitting in the hospital cafe when she overheard a conversation between two nurses. They were talking about an unusual dog that had been seen near the hospital grounds, a dog that had been visiting some of the patients in the children's ward. There were whispers of a stray that had a habit of showing up at the most unexpected times, always at just the right moment. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She stood up, her pulse quickening as she made her way to the window overlooking the hospital grounds. There, just outside the entrance, she saw him, a familiar figure, his coat shining in the sunlight. Charlie. She watched as he trotted toward the building, his tail wagging gently as he walked with purpose. It was as if he had been drawn to the hospital again, not by coincidence, but by something deeper, something that Grace couldn't quite put into words. There was no doubt in her mind that Charlie had known the baby needed him, and now, as if fulfilling his unspoken mission, he had come back to see how the little one was doing. Grace felt a warm smile spread across her face. She walked toward the door, opening it just as Charlie paused in front of the entrance, looking up at her with those wise, brown eyes. It was as if he knew her heart's deepest thoughts, knew the gratitude and love she felt for him. And in that moment, Grace realized something profound. Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder of something she had almost forgotten in her years of medical training and protocols. The power of unconditional love, of being there for someone when they needed it the most, even when no one else could. He had been the one to give the baby a chance at life, and now, just by being present, he had given Grace a sense of peace. Charlie sat down by the entrance, his gaze never leaving Grace. It wasn't a gesture of needing anything. It was simply the silent acknowledgement of a job well done. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Charlie tilted his head, his eyes meeting hers one last time. Without a word, he stood up and turned, walking away from the hospital as quietly as he had arrived. Grace watched him go, a sense of finality settling in her chest. Charlie had done his part, and now it was time for him to move on. She had no idea where he would go next, but she knew that wherever he was needed, he would be there. And as the baby continued to thrive, as her condition improved beyond expectation, Grace realized that miracles didn't always need to be understood. They just had to be believed in. Charlie had been a part of that belief, and now, in the quiet of the hospital, Grace felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. Some things were meant to remain unexplained. Some bonds, unbreakable. As the days turned into weeks, the story of the miraculous dog who had saved a baby's life spread quietly through the hospital. Staff, patients, and even visitors spoke in hushed tones about the incredible dog that had brought hope when it was needed most. But Grace, whenever asked, would only smile softly and say, "Sometimes, love is the best medicine." And deep in her heart, she knew that Charlie, in his own quiet way, had changed everything. Months passed, and the hospital continued its daily rhythm. The baby, whose survival had once seemed uncertain, was now a healthy, thriving child, her recovery nothing short of miraculous. The staff often looked at the baby in awe, unable to explain her sudden improvement. The records, the tests, the charts, they didn't make sense, but the results were undeniable. The baby was alive, and she was doing well. Grace had returned to her usual duties, but her heart often drifted back to that fateful time in the ICU when Charlie had come into their lives. She still found herself reflecting on his quiet, unassuming presence, the way he had sat by the baby's crib, offering something no medical equipment or doctor could, comfort and connection. One evening, as Grace sat in her office after a long shift, she found herself gazing out of the window. The city lights twinkled below, and the soft hum of the hospital filtered through the building. It was a peaceful moment, but a sadness lingered in her chest. She had grown fond of the dog, and though she had never expected it, Charlie had become more than just a visitor in the ICU. He had been a part of something extraordinary, a moment that had forever altered her perspective on medicine, life, and love. It was on this quiet evening, when the world outside seemed so still, that Grace was struck by the realization that Charlie had probably moved on, leaving the hospital and the baby behind. He had given everything he could, and now, his mission was complete. Grace stood up, stretching her arms above her head, and decided to take a walk around the hospital. She had always found peace in the night air, and this time, she felt the need for it more than ever. As she walked down the familiar hallways, her mind returned to Charlie once again. Where was he now? What had become of him? She knew he couldn't stay in one place forever. That wasn't who he was. But there was something about him. Something that told her he was still out there, somewhere, doing what he did best. As she passed the ICU, she noticed a small group of visitors gathered near the entrance, chatting quietly as they waited for their loved ones. Her eyes wandered over to the hospital garden outside, where she saw a familiar figure sitting at the edge of the path. Charlie. It was as though he had been waiting for her, sitting there quietly as if his mission was far from over. His coat gleamed in the soft moonlight, and his eyes met Grace's with that same knowing gaze she had seen so many times before. A surge of emotion washed over Grace as she approached him. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially not this soon, and the connection she felt to him in that moment was almost overwhelming. She knelt down beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "You've come back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Charlie didn't bark, didn't jump up to greet her. Instead, he simply sat there, calmly and quietly, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her. There was no grand gesture, no loud display of affection, just the presence of a dog who had given so much, asked for nothing, and was now content with the part he had played. Grace sat with him for a while, her thoughts a mix of gratitude and sorrow. She knew this was the end of Charlie's time at the hospital, and that his journey had reached its natural conclusion. He had healed, not just the baby, but her as well. He had shown her a truth she hadn't fully understood until now, that sometimes the most powerful medicine in the world didn't come in the form of pills or injections, but in the form of love, companionship, and the quiet moments of connection that could change everything. As the hours passed, Grace rose to her feet, a final sense of peace settling in her heart. She knew that Charlie would soon be gone, but he would never be forgotten. His presence had left a permanent mark on her life, on the lives of the staff, and most of all, on the baby whose life he had saved. "Goodbye, Charlie," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. With a soft, final glance, Charlie stood and turned toward the horizon, walking away slowly, as though he knew the time had come. He had done what he was meant to do. Now, It was time for him to move on to his next chapter, wherever that may be. Grace watched him disappear into the distance, feeling an immense sense of gratitude for the quiet, powerful presence that had been a part of the miracle in that hospital. Some stories, she thought, didn't need to be understood to be believed. And Charlie's story, no matter where it led, would always be one of the greatest she had ever known. As she returned to the hospital, she felt lighter. Charlie had left a piece of himself with her, and in return, she had learned something that would stay with her forever. The healing power of love in all its forms. Sometimes, the most powerful connections are the ones we can't explain. Just like Charlie, who brought a ray of hope to a tiny, fragile life when it seemed all was lost. It reminds us that miracles don't always come in the form we expect. They can be as simple as a loyal companion showing up at the right moment. If you believe in the magic of unexpected connections and the healing power of love, share this story with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever experienced something that changed your life in ways you can't quite explain, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us your story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our community for more incredible tales of hope, compassion, and miracles. Because sometimes, the greatest gift we can give is believing in the impossible,